Hachette Audio presents a Mel Brooks book, Young Frankenstein, the story of the making of the film. Written by Mel Brooks with Rebecca Keegan, with a foreword written and read by Judd Apatow. Read by Mel Brooks, Michael Gruskoff, Ellen Archer, and Robert Petkoff. Includes a Mac and PC-compatible PDF of photos.
Forward.
Mel Brooks is the funniest. That we all agree on. There is no need to debate it. All of us who try to make comedy know we will never be the best. Mel wins. What we can debate is which is the best Mel Brooks movie. Yes, this is a subjective question. If you choose Blazing Saddles or The Producers or High Anxiety, I can't prove you wrong. But allow me to make the case for Young Frankenstein. Young Frankenstein is perfect. It's the comedy equivalent of Sgt. Pepper or The Great Gatsby or the '86 New York Mets. The pace and joke compression are off the charts. The laughs are huge. The jokes land like the punches of a prize fighter in furious volleys from all different angles, the big ones landing when you least expect them. What modern comedy doesn't owe a debt of gratitude to Young Frankenstein? The physical comedy is both precise and insane. The genre parody is spot on and meticulously detailed. There have been a million spoof movies since, but none of them even comes close. You don't need to know a thing about Frankenstein to love this movie. Plus, Marty Feldman's looks to camera are so well-timed and iconic, he's basically inventing The Office in 1974. Gene Wilder, also the co-writer, is on fire throughout the movie. He's like a comedy cheat code. It's unfair. One second he's screaming at the top of his lungs, mania in his eyes, and the next second he's teasing extra laughs with just the tiniest look or smile or gesture. The casting is perfect. The women in Young Frankenstein are historically hysterical. What is funnier than Frau Blucher slowly turning to Dr. Frankenstein and asking him if he'd like some Ovaltine? Or Inga's role in the hay? Terry Garr, Cloris Leachman, Madeline Kahn. Mel directed these brilliant women in some of their finest performances. Okay, their finest performances, in my opinion. Even Gene Hackman is funny in it. When has Gene Hackman ever been that riotously funny? Sure, he was funny in Superman 3, or was it 4? But the spilled soup bit is as good as comedy gets. Every part of Young Frankenstein is perfect. When Gene Wilder is lecturing the class at the beginning of the movie, the science kind of makes sense. He sounds like he knows what he's talking about. And the movie is genuinely scary sometimes. The monster's speech at the end is emotional and touching. The sets and photography are gorgeous. Even without these things, it would still be one of the funniest movies of all time. But the fact that it succeeds in so many arenas is what makes it the absolute high watermark. Its credibility makes everything funnier and more impactful. Another thing to keep in mind, Mel Brooks made Young Frankenstein and Blazing Saddles in the same year. Has a director ever had a better year than Mel Brooks in 1974? Victor Fleming made Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz in 1939, but Gone with the Wind isn't funny at all. Mel wins again. A few years ago, I went to see Young Frankenstein at a revival house, and it got the loudest, most sustained laughs I have ever heard in a theater. I was jealous, but then I realized I will never fight as well as Ali, I will never paint as beautifully as Picasso, and I will never be as funny as Mel Brooks. But even if you're only a third as funny as Mel, that still will make for a comfortable living. I am so glad that this book of beautiful photographs and information about this classic film is out. Maybe I will learn something. If I work hard, hopefully, I can get to 40%. Respectfully, Judd Apatow.
Introduction. You know, you have to really know a genre to make fun of it. And to really know it, you have to love it. When I was young, I loved the movies because they saved my life. I was so grateful to cinema for opening up worlds that were not open to me as a poor Jewish kid from Williamsburg in Brooklyn. I was born in 1926, and everybody in my building was headed for jobs in the garment district in Manhattan. Well, I assumed I'd be working in the shipping department somewhere on 7th Avenue. I never dreamed I would do something else, let alone make my living in movies. Nothing else was open to us then. But at the local movie theater, I could go anywhere. Arabia, the West, Transylvania. We played street games to keep busy in Williamsburg. Punchball, baseball, roller hockey. But nothing nourished our dreams like the movies. Those movies gave us lovely worlds to inhabit. When I was a teenager and I saw Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dancing on shiny, big black and white floors, wow! You never saw shiny, big black and white floors in Williamsburg. It was just oilcloth and sometimes Jewish newspapers covering them when your mother would wash them. We never had money for anything, but for one thin dime, you got 3 feature films, a race, some newsreels, some shorts. My mother would send me to the theater with a salmon and tomato sandwich wrapped in wax paper because it was a long, long day. I was 5 years old in 1931 when James Whale's Frankenstein came out. The following summer, the movie played at a theater in Williamsburg, and my older brother Bernie took me to see it. My father had died of tuberculosis when he was only 34 and I was 2. And then there was Mama, 30 years old, with 4 little boys. Mama had to clean. She wanted me out. Bernie said, I'm going to see Frankenstein. Maybe he will get scared. My mother said, I don't care. Take him. So Bernie took me, and that movie scared the hell out of me. I was really, seriously terrified. Big mistake. It was the scariest thing I ever saw in my life. Well, that was a pretty hot summer in Brooklyn, and in our 2-bedroom apartment, I slept right by the fire escape. I said to my mother, Ma, please close the window. She said, it's 100 degrees in here. I can't close the window. What's the matter? I said, if you leave the window open, Frankenstein will come and eat me. We called the monster Frankenstein because we didn't know the difference. He's going to eat me. My mother said, okay, let's talk about this. First of all, the monster lives in Transylvania, Romania. Romania is not near the ocean, so he's going to have to get to Odessa or someplace to get a boat to America. He's going to have to go a long way to get that boat. Then he has to have money to pay for his passage. He may not have any money. Monsters don't carry money. He may not even have pockets. Well, let's say he gets money and he makes his way to Odessa and he gets a boat to America. The boat may go to Miami. It may go to Baltimore. It may not go to New York. All right, let's say it goes to New York, and he gets off there. He doesn't know our subway system. If he finds the BMT, what we used to call the subway back then was the BMT, and he gets to Brooklyn, he doesn't even know our street. Let's say he does find our street. But remember, the people on the first floor of our building, they have their window open too. He's not going to climb up 5 flights. If he's hungry and he's going to eat somebody, he's going to eat who's ever on the first floor. You know, my mother made sense. So I said, okay, leave the window open. But that movie haunted me. Actually, it haunted me for years. I mean, it was the scariest thing. I was always worried. And then to add insult to injury, this guy, James Whale, kept making more and more Frankenstein movies. Well, more than 40 years later, when I was finally a little less scared, Whale's movies would inspire me and my friend and collaborator, Gene Wilder, to make Young Frankenstein. I first met Gene in 1963 when he was starring in a Broadway production of Mother Courage with Anne Bancroft, whom I was dating at the time and would later marry. Gene and I would go on to make 3 wonderful movies together. The Producers in 1967, Blazing Saddles in 1974, and Young Frankenstein, also in 1974, which I consider our biggest achievement. Gene was absolutely incredible as Dr. Frankenstein in that. He was amazing. In Mother Courage, Gene Wilder played a chaplain He'd come off the stage and say to me, I was standing in the wings, and he'd say to me, "Why are they laughing at me?" And I said, "Look in the mirror. Blame God. You're meant to be funny. You can be other things, but you're always going to be funny. Don't fight it. Just be sincere and always be amazed at the fact that they're laughing at you. It'll be good for you. It'll be good for your career." Gene and I hung out. We were good pals. We used to go out to dinner a lot. And I would tell Gene all about what I was doing. I was writing a script called Springtime for Hitler. It wasn't called The Producers yet. I'd tell him about this character, Leo Bloom. He's silly. He's angelic. He's tragic. He's the most brilliant accountant who ever lived. But as a human being, he's lost. He doesn't know how to behave. He's never been kissed. He doesn't know anything about anything. Gene said, I could play that character. But he never thought we'd ever get the money to make it. Gene was growing as an artist. One day he replaced Alan Arkin on Broadway in a Murray Chisgall play called Love, L-U-V. He was in his dressing room taking off his makeup between a matinee and an evening performance when Sidney Glaser, the producer of The Producers, and I walked in. I threw a script down on the makeup table and said, "Never get the money, huh? Never do it, huh? Okay. In 2 months, we're going to be at Mendy Brown's studio on 26th Street, and we're going to start shooting The Producers, and you are going to be Leo Bloom." Gene held his hands over his face and wept. And I said, "Look, I can't use you if you just keep crying. You got to act." Gene is the most natural actor who ever lived. And I said to him, "Listen, Gene, you're free to do anything you want in this movie. I love you." Well, that's how we started working together. And as much as I had wanted Gene for The Producers, I didn't want him to be the Waco Kid in Blazing Saddles. I thought he might be too funny. I was shooting for the stars. I wanted the eloquence of a John Gielgud in a Western outfit, a leather-faced guy who was beaten down, a real alcoholic. I didn't want him to be funny. I wanted the Black Sheriff to be funny, and a couple of other people to be funny, all the Johnsons to be funny, but I wanted the Waco Kid to be serious. Man, was I wrong. But I didn't know it yet. I hadn't realized if you can find a funny actor who can be serious, then you've got heaven. You've got the best. And that was Gene Wilder, who never knew how funny he was, who always played everything so seriously. So, to begin with, I cast Gig Young as the Waco Kid. Gig had been starring in movies going way back to the 40s. He was in a wonderful comedy called Under the Yum Yum Tree. And then he won an Academy Award for They Shoot Horses, Don't They, with Jane Fonda. He had a serious alcoholic problem. I loved it. He was a serious alcoholic, and the Waco Kid was an alcoholic. His agent said, "Don't worry about it. Gig's over it, no problem. He's licked it." So we did the first day of shooting. It became clear that he wasn't wholly over it. He was hung upside down in the jail cell. And the sheriff comes over and says, "Are we awake?" And he's supposed to say, "I don't know. Are we black?" And he said, "Are we black?" And green stuff spewed from his mouth. And I said to my assistant director, "Wait a minute, are we making The Exorcist? What's happening here?" Anyway, I knew that Gig was not over his alcoholism, that he was suffering from a bad case of DTs. So I had to look for somebody else. That night, with my star in no shape to film, I called Gene to cry to him. He said, "Mel, I know every line." I had sent Gene a script about 6 months earlier, and he had memorized everything immediately. He had an amazing ability to do that. Gene came out the next day, tried on a costume, picked out a horse. That was Saturday. On Sunday, we did one rehearsal, and on Monday morning at 9 o'clock, we were shooting, and he was the Waco Kid, the perfect Waco Kid. Little did I know that when Gene showed up to film Blazing Saddles, he was plotting to get me on board on a crazy new movie that he thought up called Young Frankenstein. Lucky for me, it worked. Of all of my films, I am the proudest of this one. We set out to make a beautiful period picture with all the craftsmanship that James Whale's 1930s films had, and of course, this time with a few laughs. My hope was that Young Frankenstein would transport audiences the way I was transported as a kid, sitting in the dark in Williamsburg. I think we succeeded, and in this book, I will show you how we did it.
Listening to Young Frankenstein. This is a behind-the-scenes guide to the making of Young Frankenstein, but you know that. You already bought the audiobook. The audiobook works a lot like the movie, with Mel Brooks directing the whole story and a great cast pulling it together. Mel's parts all sound like this.
I'm Mel Brooks. This is my audiobook about making Young Frankenstein.
But a lot of other people remembered making the movie too. Their stories come from interviews done just for this audiobook, books they wrote in the past, on-set reporting, and interviews they gave to newspapers and on TV when the film came out. When it's time for their part of the story, it will sound like this.
Michael Gruskoff on Mel Brooks.
As the producer, it was an exciting time working with Mel, Gene, and the very talented group of actors Mel cast in the film. It went so well I could actually sit back and enjoy the magic that was taking place.
In the accompanying PDF, when you see a spread of pages with film reels down the side, you'll get the chance to relive the funniest and most iconic scenes from this classic film. You'll also see lots of photos from the film and set. And that's all you need to know. The cast and crew of the audiobook hope you enjoy discovering all the love and hard work that went into making what has become a truly legendary movie, Young Frankenstein.
Chapter 1. A Fierce Collaboration.
In 1973, at the time, we were setting up Young Frankenstein. The hit movies of the day were The Sting, a caper, The Way We Were, a romance, The Exorcist, a horror film. No comedies. Personally, I hadn't made a nickel for any studio. I made The Producers in 1968, didn't make a penny. It did get me an Academy Award for Original Screenplay, but it didn't make any money. I made The 12 Chairs, a wonderful movie in 1970, which made even less than no money. Blazing Saddles would be a hit in 1974, but that hadn't come out yet. To the studios, I was just a very interesting guy to meet for lunch, short but interesting. Gene Wilder's career was still building, and he was not yet the household name he would become. He had played a small but critically acclaimed part in Bonnie and Clyde, been nominated for an Academy Award for his performance as Leo Bloom in The Producers, and begun to emerge in bigger roles in films like Willy Wonka and The Chocolate Factory. At this point, neither one of us knew how much the events of the next 18 months would change our lives. But let's back up. There we were in this western town somewhere in the Antelope Valley in California in the middle of making Blazing Saddles. I was yelling action, cut. Gene was leaning back in the sheriff's chair with his legs up on the desk, in his cowboy hat and his boots. He had a yellow legal pad, and he was writing and writing and writing. I looked at the top of the legal pad, and it said, Young Frankenstein. So I said to Gene, what the hell is that? I have this idea for a movie about Baron Frankenstein's grandson. He's an uptight scientist who doesn't believe in any of that nonsense about bringing the dead back to life. Even though he is clinically a scientist, he is as crazy as any Frankenstein, but it's in his heart, it's in his blood, it's in the marrow of his bones. He can't help it. Sounds interesting, I said. What is your dream for this movie? My dream is for you to write it with me and direct the movie. I said, whoa, that's going to cost you. Got any money on you? He said, I've got $57. I said, well, it's a beginning. I'll take it as a down payment. I took the $57, and together we began writing Young Frankenstein. That very night, after shooting Blazing Saddles, I went over to Gene's hotel, the Bel Air, just to discuss, but we got crazy, and we spent until 4 or 5 in the morning talking about the storyline and drinking Earl Grey tea and a thing called digestive biscuit, some kind of English biscuit. We talked and talked about being very faithful to the tempo and the look of James Whale's marvelous films. Frankenstein from 1931 and Bride of Frankenstein from 1935. Gene already had an 8-page treatment, and we quickly got into the rhythm of working. Each night after I finished in the editing room, editing Blazing Saddles, and had dinner with my wife, I'd run over to Gene's hotel. And at the beginning, we just had all the James Whale movies, but we knew exactly where we were going. Gene wrote everything in pencil on his yellow legal pad, which my secretary typed up the next day. It was really a fierce, fierce collaboration, and we were devoted to our script. We had only one fight, and that was a big fight. It was the one over a scene where the monster dances to Puttin' on the Ritz. I told Gene, look, it's a great idea, it's funny, but it was too far outside of our salute to the black and white classics. I thought, well, we could go as far as the zipper on the creature's neck, but we didn't want to be too ridiculous. Gene said, no, it's proof of how incredible Frankenstein's creation is. We fought, and I said, okay, I'll film it, and we'll test screen it. And if enough people agree with me that it's too silly, we'll take it out. Of course, Gene was dead right, because it took the movie to another level, our level. We left James Whale and we went to where we wanted to be. That's what audiences were paying for. They weren't paying for a true artistic resemblance to James Whale's movies. They also wanted to laugh. In a way, it was like an affirmation of something I learned while writing sketches for Sid Caesar on your show of shows in the 1950s. Jokes alone don't work, but jokes that emerge out of characters and stories do work. Sid used to ask me interminable questions about the inner life of the characters we created. Would he wear a coat on a hot day? Would he pick up a check or wouldn't he? What does he like? What does he hate? He wanted to know every aspect of the characters he was playing. On Young Frankenstein, we asked ourselves, would the monster enjoy a nice Irving Berlin tune? Yes, he would. So would the audience.
All about Puttin' on the Ritz.
One of the great thrills of my life is song and dance. Music is thrilling, and to dance to it is God's perfection. In every movie I make, I try to do some sort of production number. We shot the Puttin' on the Ritz sequence at the Mayfair Music Hall, a vaudeville-style theater in Santa Monica built in 1911. It took about 5 days to shoot. It was a little theater and very hard to light. Kenneth Morris, who played Inspector Kemp, and Richard Roth, who played the inspector's assistant, were stationed at the back of the theater. And I couldn't get enough light on them to point them out. I didn't want to put too much light on the auditorium because in those days they used candlelight. It drove me crazy. Finally, our cinematographer, the great Gerald Hirschfeld, hid some hot lights in the back, and we went forward. For the dance number, I leaned on Alan Johnson, a choreographer who had done Springtime for Hitler for me in The Producers. Alan taught me how to teach Gene and Peter the steps, working out the timing with not only the taps, but also the cane. It's very intricate tapping if you use the cane as well as taps. And I came up with, God bless me, doing the punchline of the monster's long drawn-out, "Put on the Ritz." I said to Peter Boyle, you don't have to stay in key for that. You're the monster. Just do it enthusiastically. Blow your top. It was a great moment. Put on the Ritz. Well, we kept having to cut it because the audience of extras went crazy. I had to say, wait a minute, you're not supposed to laugh. You're supposed to be afraid of that guy. You're killing the scene. We finally got it right. He did it. It was great, and the audience behaved.
Gene Wilder's big idea.
I had just done everything you always wanted to know about sex with Woody Allen. It was March or April, and I had a little place in West Hampton Beach, Long Island. And after lunch, I took a little yellow legal pad and a blue felt tip pen and I wrote Young Frankenstein on top. And then for 2 pages, I thought about what could happen to me if I was an heir to Beaufort von Frankenstein's whole estate in Transylvania. Later on that summer, Mike Medavoy, who was my agent at the time, said, "Is there anything for you, Peter Boyle, and Marty Feldman?" I said, "What made you think of that combination?" He says, "Because I now handle you, Peter, and Marty." I said, "Well, what an artistic basis." As it happens, I think I do. I wrote 2 more pages, the Transylvania station, almost verbatim the way it is, and Mike Medavoy called me and said, "I think I can sell this. What do you think about Mel directing?" I said, "I'd love it, but you're whistling Dixie because he won't direct something he didn't conceive of."
Mike Medavoy, then agent of Gene Wilder.
One of the things I told Gene Wilder when I started handling him was, "You ought to be writing." One day I was sitting in my office at IFA. Marty Feldman had just walked in with his wife, and Peter Boyle walked in too. I called Gene and said, "Gene, do you have a project for the 3 of you?" In my mind, I thought putting together Gene, Marty, and Peter was a way to do the Three Stooges. I thought that was a really good package. Frankly, it was a bit of happenstance. Marty and Peter happened to be in my office, and it was kismet, as so many things in life are.
Michael Gruskoff, producer.
In the summer of 1959, my friends and I chipped in and rented a house on Fire Island off the coast of New York for $500 apiece. We would go to Charlie Cash's house, a Gatsby-like character who threw hip parties. At those parties, I'd cross paths with many fascinating people, including Mel Brooks. Later, I worked in the mailroom at the William Morris Agency, and sometimes I'd see Mel there walking the halls. Fast forward to the early 1970s, I was working as a producer, and movies like Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, and Easy Rider had paved the way for auteurs like Spielberg, Coppola, Lucas, Scorsese, and Mel, all of whom had original and unique voices. Then agent Mike Medavoy sent me the treatment for Young Frankenstein that was written by his client, Gene Wilder. I read it, I loved it, and I told Gene I wanted to be part of it. Mel was coming to Los Angeles to meet with Warner Brothers on Blazing Saddles and told Gene he would meet with me while he was on his trip. I went to meet Mel at the Beverly Hills Hotel to discuss Gene's treatment. It had been years since I'd seen him. I knocked on his door, which he immediately opened, looked me up and down, and slammed the door in my face. He quickly reopened it and said, "You're Michael Gruskoff, you pisher you? Where are your friends? Where's your bathing suit?" He remembered me. I sat down, and within 5 minutes, Mel said, "You produced the movie. Get us a deal. I need the money." And I did just that.
We knew Young Frankenstein had to be in black and white if we were honestly going to salute those Universal Pictures of the 30s. And we thought we needed $2 million to do it. So this brilliant hustler, our producer, Michael Gruskoff, set up a meeting with Columbia Pictures. The meeting was fine. They loved the script. They loved the idea. They wanted to make it. We love you, blah, blah, blah. Except on the way out, I shouted, "Oh, by the way, we're going to make this picture in black and white," and then shut the door and left. A thundering herd of Jews followed us down the hall from the meeting room. They were screaming, "No, wait, come back. No black and white. Peru just got color, no black and white." Well, the thing about satire is the walls, the floors, the costumes, the sets, everything surrounding the comedy has to be real. So our movie had to be in black and white in order to work. The guys at Columbia said, "Okay, here's a compromise. We'll shoot it in color and then we'll diffuse it and take the color out." I passed on that because I knew later they'll trick you and release it in color anyway. I said no. There's a stock called AGFA, AGFA. It's a German black and white film. It's true, it's rich, it's black and white, and you can't make it in color no matter what. The Columbia guy said, well, we'll let you know. Michael Gruskoff already had his wheels turning. He had a friend, somebody I'd never met, called Alan Ladd Jr., who had just taken over at 20th Century Fox. Right away, we hit it off. Laddie had a lot of faith in me. He said, use Stage 5 at Fox. It's enormous, it's gorgeous, it's yours. He said, make the movie in black and white, and here's some extra money. He gave us $2.4 million. We left Columbia, and we went to 20th Century Fox.
Alan Ladd Jr., Laddie, on signing up Young Frankenstein.
In 1973, I had just come to 20th Century Fox to be their head of creative affairs after working as a producer in England. I had been back in town for a couple months, and I was looking for good material. I read a draft of the Young Frankenstein screenplay and thought it was very funny and very much wanted to do it, but I heard it was set up at Columbia. I had seen the first couple of reels of Blazing Saddles, which I found hilarious. I had seen the producers before that, and I thought Gene and Mel were brilliant together. I loved the idea of Young Frankenstein right away, so when I heard Columbia was passing, I explained to Gordon Stolberg, who was then the president of Fox, what it was all about, and we met with Mel and Mike Gruskoff immediately. Mel said, I want it to be in black and white. I said, that's all right. All the old horror films were in black and white. It made sense to me. But I did worry about the black and white. A lot of theater owners wouldn't take a movie unless it was in color. The truth is, I was worried about it, but I didn't tell them that. And we made the deal.
On James Whale.
Okay, let me tell you a little about the two geniuses whose work inspired the movie. A woman called Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, the English novelist who wrote Frankenstein, or as she called it, the modern Prometheus, back in 1818. And James Whale, the English director of the classic horror films Frankenstein and The Bride of Frankenstein. Well, Gene Wilder and I had both read Mary Shelley's book when we sat down to write this script. Mary Shelley was just 19 when she wrote Frankenstein. She was on a trip to Geneva with her husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. She set out to write a short ghost story and ended up penning what would become one of the first true works of science fiction and the ultimate story about men playing God. The whole idea that you could reanimate dead tissue came from her. James Whale's talent was in how he told the Frankenstein story visually. Gene and I watched Whale's movies together multiple times. We saw how this guy took his time. Whale wanted everything to be deep, dark, somber. He had worked in the theater before he started in film, which is where he met Colin Clive, the actor, who plays the insane Dr. Frankenstein. When Whale's Frankenstein came out, it was a smash hit and catapulted Boris Karloff, who played the monster, into stardom. Whale kind of got pigeonholed as a horror director, and he would go on to direct The Old Dark House, The Invisible Man, and of course, The Bride of Frankenstein, which we in our film reference liberally. Whale knew exactly how to scare the heck out of you, but he was also a great artist who was not really appreciated for those talents as much as he should have been.
You're putting me on.
No, it's pronounced Frankenstein.
Do you also say Froderick?
No, Frederick.
Well, why isn't it Froderick Frankenstein?
It isn't. It's Frederick Frankenstein.
I see.
You must be Igor.
No, it's pronounced Igor.
But they told me it was Igor.
Well, they were wrong then, weren't they?
You were sent by Herr Falkstein, weren't you?
Yes. My grandfather used to work for your grandfather.
How nice.
Of course, the rates have gone up.
Of course. Of course. I'm sure we'll get along splendidly. Oh, sorry. I don't mean to embarrass you, but I'm a rather brilliant surgeon. Perhaps I could help you with that hump.
What hamp?
Chapter 2. A Perfect Cast.
Well, I was blessed with such a talented group of actors on Young Frankenstein. But the truth is, you can cast talented people, and that still doesn't mean a movie is going to turn out well. There was a certain indefinable chemistry on this set, a magic in the way this ensemble of gifted misfits worked together. It was kismet. I'd never seen it before. I've never seen it since. One sign of the unbelievable chemistry on this set was that Peter Boyle, my monster, met his future wife, Lorraine, right there when she came to visit us on the set as a journalist. I only had 3 weeks of rehearsals before we began shooting. I love rehearsals because it gives the actors an opportunity to get comfortable with each other, with their costumes, their accents. I said to the actors, "We're making a riotous comedy here, but it's got to be very sweet, very sad, and at times very scary. And it's got to be very real. More than anything, it's got to be very real. No heightened acting. When it's funny, your character doesn't know it's funny. You're just doing your job. We know when it's funny. The audience knows when it's funny. But you don't know when it's funny. So don't ever play funny." Part of what drove me to start directing was writing for other comics who told me, "I want to make it my own." I'd say, "Look, the jokes are written, the relationships are written. First, do it as written. Later, you can make it your own." A lot of people don't realize that without a valley, there's no peak. Without information, there's no joke. You've got to set things up. With my Young Frankenstein cast, this was never an issue. These were actors who respected what was on the page and yet knew how to improvise. It was the best of both worlds.
Mike Fenton, formerly of Fenton Feinberg Casting.
When I look back on the 1970s, the beauty of that period was that the agents were so helpful. Smaller agencies were run by entrepreneurs who represented only 1 or 2 actors, but they were good ones. That era was about building careers and trusting the smaller agents. When we called actors in for an audition, we weren't looking for actors just for one project. We would have someone come in to read for a Francis Ford Coppola project, and if they were wrong for that role but right for Mel Brooks, we'd bring them to Mel. It allowed directors to see a much broader base of actors. Mel's an impish character who is able to make you laugh just by saying, "That tree is green." There's something in his makeup that is funny. Mel himself is castable. When you have a leader like Mel who embodies what a picture is about, it makes it easier for the cast to come together. My partner Jane Feinberg and I worked with him several times, and his direction on Young Frankenstein was to look for characters who would be believable, but who were also far out, strange-looking, and comedic. All the individuals on that cast brought themselves to that motion picture. They fit the bill. Marty Feldman was a genius, no question. Ken Mars came in and was supposed to have the fake arm. He starts to raise his hand to salute and can't, so he salutes with the other hand. It's things like that you look at and wonder, what the hell is he doing? But it worked, because he was a very funny man who fit that bill. He was Inspector Kemp. When he acted straight, it was funny because Inspector Kemp was a buffoon. Casting Inga was tricky because of the accent, but Terry Garr was so brilliant that it didn't matter if her accent wasn't exactly perfect. In fact, if her accent had been perfect, it probably wouldn't have been as funny. The base cast was just wonderful. They were who Mel was looking for, and he was excited to get them. Mel is and was very appreciative of his crew and Jane and myself and what everyone brought to the picture.
Dr. Frankenstein, Gene Wilder.
It all started with Gene Wilder, who was Dr. Frankenstein. He was that guy. Gene intuited all my directions. Sometimes all I needed from Gene was either for him to be softer when he was screaming or louder when he mumbled. But I never had to give him an emotional direction. He understood it perfectly. Nobody can go from A to Z in one scene like Gene Wilder does. In the scene where he goes into the monster's cell, he's so sure of himself no matter what you hear there, no matter how cruelly I beg you, no matter how terribly I may scream, do not open this door. Do you hear me? Do not open this door. He was so in charge. He was so smart. Then he tiptoes in, and when the monster breaks his chains and growls at him, he goes from this commanding doctor to a frightened pussycat. What a gamut, what a gamut. From surety and perfect command to just a scared kid screaming for his life. Nobody could have done that scene half as well as Gene Wilder. Nobody. His acting, his loungewear, his perfect mustache, his beautiful shiny hair all evoked the style of a 1930s matinee idol. He never cared about looking handsome. He just wanted to be in character. He chose to be in the lab coat for most of the movie, and then picked out an old-fashioned salt and pepper English jacket with a belt in the back. He knew how Freddie Frankenstein dressed.
Gene Wilder on Mel's direction.
Mel gives me the most insane things to do, and I carry them out realistically. My job was to make him more subtle. His job was to make me more broad. I would say, I don't want this to be blazing Frankenstein, and he'd answer, I don't want an art film that only 14 people see.
Michael Gruskoff on Gene and Mel.
Mel directing Gene was like Billy Wilder directing Jack Lemmon. Young Frankenstein was the third film they made together, and we all benefited from the shorthand between them. It's sad they never made another film together, but the ones they have made will remain classics.
Classic film inspiration. Colin Clive as Dr. Frankenstein in the James Whale classics. Also known for The Producers, 1968, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, 1971, Blazing Saddles, 1974. Favorite line?
No, it's pronounced Frankenstein.
The Monster, Peter Boyle.
I first saw Peter Boyle in the movie Joe, a tough political story in which he played a terrible person. In Young Frankenstein, the monster is scary and miserable, but there is a sweet child in the middle of him. Gene Wilder said, listen, Peter can do both. So he did a few readings, and Gene was absolutely right. Peter was a consummate artist, and the beauty of him came through. His soul shone through. Peter's platform boots extended his 6'2" height by 6 inches, and padded clothing added heft. We wanted him big, tall, and monstrous. Once he was in his monster makeup, Peter's complexion was mint green, which photographed beautifully in black and white. At the beginning, it was close to 4 or 5 hours to do Peter's makeup, and getting it off was another hour and a half. But he never complained. I wanted the monster to scare the hell out of the audience and still, in the end, be beautiful and eloquent, and he was. Peter watched Frankenstein, the Bride of Frankenstein, the Son of Frankenstein, Frankenstein's cousin Vinny. He watched everything. I asked which one he liked the best, and he said the first one. He loved Boris Karloff, moving his head slowly and keeping his eyes in slits. I said, absolutely. Right, spot on.
Peter Boyle on The Monster.
The Frankenstein monster I play as a baby. He's big and ugly and scary, but he's just been born, remember, and it's been traumatic, and to him the whole world is a brand new alien environment. That's how I'm playing it.
Peter Boyle tells Lorraine Alterman Boyle about working with Mel.
Mel pays a lot of attention to the performers, especially because in a comedy it's the timing. Everybody here is a pretty good performer, so he can really work fast, but to do humor, the timing is critical. It's got to be right, or else it's not as funny. In this movie especially, there's just a lot of things that exist solely for the timing of them. We're taking a great deal of care with that. Mel's a very hard worker. He has this image of being this lovable nut, but he's an incredibly hard worker.
Classic film inspiration. Boris Karloff as the monster in the James Whale classics. Also known for Joe, 1970, The Candidate, 1972, Taxi Driver, 1976, Everybody Loves Raymond, 1996. Favorite line?
Putting on the Ritz!
Igor, Marty Feldman.
I met Marty Feldman once before in England where he was making a television show called The Marty Feldman Comedy Machine, which my friend, Larry Gelbart, was writing. I fell in love with Marty instantly. Marty had this medical condition with his eyes, and I used to say, if you want to hide from Marty Feldman, put your nose against his nose and he'll never see you. His eyes went to the sides. But mostly, I loved his pauses. No one has the courage to pause in a scene as long as Marty Feldman did. I'll never forget when we were filming the dinner table scene, Terry said to Gene, "You haven't touched your food." And Gene started slapping the food on his plate and said, there, now I've touched it. Happy? It was all embarrassing. Marty was supposed to talk next, but he didn't. We were waiting and waiting. And then Marty said, "You know, I'll never forget my old dad. When these things would happen to him, the things he'd say to me." And then he didn't talk again. And again we were waiting and waiting and waiting. Finally, Gene couldn't take it anymore and shouted, "What? What did he say?" And Marty said, "What the hell are you doing in the bathroom day and night? Why don't you get out and give someone else a chance?" Then he stuck his fork into a potato and slowly put it in his mouth and turned away. It was the most insane, remarkable scene and moment I ever filmed.
Marty Feldman on Gene Wilder.
Gene's timing was like Oliver Hardy. It forced me to be Stan Laurel. I was very nervous. It was a night shoot, very cold. I was freezing and very scared because it was my first Hollywood movie. The "walk this way" line, I did that to make the crew laugh, and Mel Brooks said, "Let's shoot it." I said, "You can't, it's an old joke." So we did it, and we did it the other way without that joke, and afterward Gene said to me, "Tell Mel to take that joke out, it's terrible." I said, "Well, I don't want it in. You tell him. You wrote the script with him." We both said, "Mel, please take that out." He left it in. He said, "I think that's funny." Audiences laughed at it. Gene and I were both wrong. Mel was right. Mel has a great instinct for comedy. There's a Yiddish phrase, Tummler. He talks comedy. He can demonstrate it. His instincts are right. All I know is when Mel says, "Let's do it," chances are he's right, even if you don't know why. He knows what people will laugh at. It's an instinct, like musicians have a sense of what swings. It's like the old story of Duke Ellington when a woman said to him, "What is jazz?" He said, "Well, if you have to ask, you'll never know." It's that. It swings or it doesn't. If your foot taps, it swings, and if you laugh, it's funny. And Mel has that, whatever it is, and a lot of it.
Michael Gruskoff on Marty Feldman.
Marty Feldman was a doll, the type of person you want to protect. If somebody came up to him asking for money, he'd say, "How much do you need?" He was a very talented actor-comedian who really knew how to get the most out of his glorious sides. He was very much in demand after Young Frankenstein and became an above-the-title film star. Who would have thought? While shooting the film, word spread of Marty's prowess as a comedic actor. He would occasionally ask my opinion on scripts that were being offered to him. One day he asked me, "Michael, will it ever be this good again?" As the producer, I feel very fortunate that Mel was able to put together one of the greatest comedic ensembles of the era. Gene, Terry, Marty, Madeline, Peter, Cloris. Working with that group was probably one of the best times of my life.
Lorraine Alterman Boyle asks Marty about his costume.
Marty tells me about his costume, which consists of basic black tights and a leotard with a hump back and incredible knobs jutting out on his skinny knees and calves. The hump turns out to be the wardrobe cushion usually used to make actresses look pregnant. "I have incredible fantasies about it," says Marty. "Was Louis Pasteur in there? Or maybe Rosemary's Baby?" The knobs? I once saw a ballet dancer who was absolutely graceful, except he had all those knobs on his legs. I thought I'd use it someday. I stuffed Kleenex in the legs to do it. When you come down to it, it's all held together by wads of Kleenex and tape. Classic film inspiration. Dwight Fry as Fritz, the laboratory assistant in James Whale's Frankenstein. Also known for Silent Movie, 1976, The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother, 1975, with co-stars Madeline Kahn and Gene Wilder. Favorite line?
What hump? Inga. Terry Garr.
Terry Garr was a dancer on television. It was Gene Wilder, not me, who insisted we audition her. The rumors during the movie they may have fallen madly in love with each other. Well, I knew Terry would be sensational when she was reading the lines where Cloris is removing the big steel restraints that kept the monster on the table. Terry was supposed to come down the steps and say, "No, no, you mustn't." In Terry's audition, with great fear in her voice, she said, "No, no, you mustn't." Mustn't, giving it just the right Transylvanian touch. She was perfect. I saw her screen test and saw that the camera loved her. Her face, her lovely white blonde hair, which shone so beautifully, and she was a dancer, so she moved so gracefully. Gene didn't know he was funny, and Terry didn't know she was sexy. She acted so innocently, like a little German farm girl.
Terry Garr on Becoming Inga.
I was originally up for the principal female role, Elizabeth. Mel Brooks had picked me out of hundreds of girls who came to the cattle call, but admitted that Madeline Kahn, who had been brilliant in Blazing Saddles, was his first choice. But then Mel told me that if I came back the next day with a German accent, I could read for the part of Inga, Gene Wilder's buxom love interest. I said, "Ja, I certainly kann." A German accent in 24 hours. Luckily, I was still on the Sonny and Cher comedy hour, and as fate would have it, Cher's wig stylist was a German woman named Renata, complete with a thick, guttural accent. The next day I made small talk with her all through Cher's hairstyling session. Needless to say, that gave me hours of study. I emerged with confidence, determination, and a perfect German accent when saying, "Mein Gott, this wig weighs 40 pounds." There was one last thing I needed for Inga, or two, to be exact. When I read the part, I realized it was really all about boobs, and I was not about to let my lack of them hinder my performance. The next day, I went in to do my imitation of Renata from Mel Brooks, wearing a fuzzy pink sweater and a huge padded bra stuffed with socks. I got the part. I was beside myself with joy. For one thing, it was the first major role in which I got to talk, not just dance, as I'd done in the Elvis movies or get buried in the sand as in Pajama Party. For the first time in life, I went home at night and thought, I've done it. If this is as far as I get, I'll be happy.
Character inspiration, Cher's hairdresser Renata. Also known for Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977, Tootsie, 1982, Mr. Mom, 1983. Favorite line?
He wird haben enormes schwanzstucker.
Elizabeth, Madeline Kahn.
I stole Madeline Kahn from Peter Bogdanovich. I saw her in What's Up, Doc, Paper Moon, and she was so great. So I cast her immediately in Blazing Saddles, and she was one of the most gifted people I ever met. Her timing, her voice, her attitude. The camera was in love with her. She had beautiful skin, auburn hair, high cheekbones, and if she wanted to, she could have been a legitimate Metropolitan Opera singer. She had such a great voice, the best pipes, the richest, deepest vibrato. She could sing anything. The only thing that held Madeline back was a psychological defect called modesty. She had played Lily von Stupp in Blazing Saddles, for which she would ultimately get an Oscar nomination. I was stunned because I didn't think the Academy was hip enough to recognize the layers, the depth of her work. When we were writing Young Frankenstein, I knew I wanted her. Gene and I thought, why doesn't Dr. Frankenstein have a fiancée who couldn't care less about the reanimation of dead tissue, but cares more about bracelets and earrings? I talked to Madeline about it, and she said, I know that character.
Madeline Kahn on becoming Elizabeth.
Mel let me craft my characters myself. After I did that, and after great appreciation of the subtleties and the nuances, he then would direct his point of view onto my performance and broaden it so it became part of his movie. The choice of singing "Ah, Sweet Mystery of Life" was my idea. It was Mel's idea that the character burst into song at that point, which was a brilliant idea, that instead of screaming as he's about to, I suppose you could say, rape her, and that's a terrible thing. It isn't really rape because you have the idea that she's terribly attracted to him. She just isn't giving in to it. At the moment, instead of screaming, she bursts into song. The song Mel originally had in the script was the beginning of Cheek to Cheek, which goes, "Heaven, I'm in heaven." As I worked on the scene alone, I couldn't figure out how to make it believable. Even though it's terribly far-fetched, I believe the only way to make it funny is to make it believable and to really believe that the moment is happening. What this has done to my brain, I really can't tell you. As I worked on it, I realized I wished there was a song that would start on an ah or an oh, so I could feel as though I were going to scream, but instead of screaming, I found that I was singing. "Oh, sweet mystery of life!" That's perfect. The words are perfect. It is so perfect. Gathering my courage together, I managed to ask Mel if we couldn't try that song in that moment, and he said, "Well, okay, we can try it."
Lorraine Alterman Boyle on the love scene.
The cave is maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, so it's crowded in there with the camera on one side, aimed toward a bed of leaves where Peter and Madeline will lie. "I can't unbutton or take anything off because the padding will show," Peter says. Mel tells him that they're shooting above the waist because they want a PG rating, and Peter should just start to unzip his fly. Peter acts it out with puzzlement followed by delight crossing his face, and then he caps it with his eyes looking down and beholding the glory of this monster at full mast. It's a brilliant and hilarious moment, all done with Peter's facial expressions. Mel loves it. The next day, inside the cave is jammed not only with the lights and camera, but also the camera operator and his assistant, the director of photography, wardrobe lady, lighting man, producer, Mel, Peter in his monster tux, and Madeline in the same sexy satin dressing gown she wore in the bedroom scene. It's rehearsal time, with the camera focused on Madeline, reclining on the bed of pine needles and reacting to the monster pulling down his fly. Peter is out of camera range, but going through the motions so that Madeline has something to react to. The sight of the monster organ conquers her fear, so that she breaks into singing, "Ah, sweet mystery of life, at last I found you." Mel is slightly bent forward, clutching his stomach with his left hand, and his right hand is extended out like Al Jolson as he mimes the words of the song.
Classic film inspiration, Valerie Hobson as Elizabeth and Elsa Lanchester as the monster's mate in James Whale's Bride of Frankenstein. Also known for Paper Moon, 1973, What's Up, Doc, 1972, Blazing Saddles, 1974, High Anxiety, 1977, History of the World, Part 1, 1981. Favorite line?
No tongues.
Frau Blücher, Cloris Leachman.
I was madly in love with Cloris right from the beginning. She could do anything. Talk about talent. She was one of the most talented people we had there. She could play anything, and her accent was perfect right from the beginning. We asked her to play Frau Blücher, like Judith Anderson's domineering and cold Mrs. Danvers from Hitchcock's Rebecca, and she got it immediately. I've heard people tell the story that the horses whinny when they hear Frau Blücher's name because Blücher means glue in German. I love the story. It makes us look smart, but it's not actually true. The truth is, there was a German general, his name was General Blücher, who was the Prussian victor in the Battle of Waterloo. And I really just like the sound of the name Blücher. The horses whinny is because Frau Blücher is ominous, and they know how crazy she is.
Cloris Leachman on Gene Wilder.
I thought the script was wonderful. I had never done a German accent before, and on the first day of shooting, I ran around asking everybody if they knew how to do one. Luckily, Mel's mother was on set that day. She knew German and Yiddish, and she helped me. We didn't have any discussion about the script, we just started. Since we made the movie, I've always asked Mel and Jean who wrote this line or that line, and they never remember. In the scene where I say, "Would the doctor care for a brandy before retiring?" Jean caught me by surprise by playing his part angry. I said, "Some warm milk, perhaps?" And Jean said, "No, thank you very much. No thanks." I had to take that anger into account. I had to maintain my appearance of superiority. I recovered myself, but I was surprised. "Ovaltine? Nothing. Thank you." I had to say my line and leave everything just fine. And with the next sentence, Jean would throw it into chaos again. But when he did, it made my lines so funny. Ovaltine? Who wrote those lines?
Classic film inspiration, Judith Anderson as Mrs. Danvers in Hitchcock's Rebecca. Also known for The Last Picture Show, 1971, High Anxiety, 1977, History of the World Part 1, 1981. Favorite line?
Yes, say it. He was my boyfriend. Inspector Kemp, Kenneth Mars.
Kenneth Mars' Inspector Kemp, with his creaky wooden arm, was a takeoff on Lionel Atwill's intense one-armed inspector in the 1939 Son of Frankenstein. Kenny was great, but he could be crazy. Fortunately, I knew how to handle him, and when we were making The Producers, I kept begging him to keep the German accent, but make it hearable. Let us understand it, because if it was pure gibberish, the audience couldn't understand it. During Young Frankenstein, when he says, "We had better confirm the fact that the young Frankenstein is indeed following in his grandfather's footsteps," I have the entire village say, "What?" So we actually get a joke out of Kenny's impenetrable dialogue.
Kenneth Mars on getting the role.
I was up in Buffalo, New York, doing a play in the winter, and the snow was up to my thigh, truly. And Mel called at half hour before curtain. He said, "What are you doing in Buffalo?" I said Nome was too warm. He says, Okay, listen. You're wearing an eye patch, and on top of the eye patch, you've got a monocle. Is that too much? And I said, No, Mel, that is not too much. He says, Good, you got the part. And that's how I got the part in Young Frankenstein.
Classic film inspiration. Lionel Atwill in Son of Frankenstein. Also known for The Producers, 1967, What's Up, Doc, 1972, The Little Mermaid, 1989, Malcolm in the Middle, 2002. Favorite line?
A riot is an ugly thing, and I think that it is just about time we had one.
Blind Man, Gene Hackman.
Gene Wilder played tennis with Gene Hackman. Hackman had done The French Connection. He was a huge star for playing the tough guy, Popeye Doyle, but he was itching to do comedy. When people saw Young Frankenstein in the theater, nobody knew the blind man was actually Gene Hackman. William Tuttle, our makeup artist, had made him this beautiful beard, and no one recognized him because of it. Hackman's line readings were hysterical, but he didn't push it. He destroyed the monster innocently, one thing after another, topping it off with a wonderful delivery of, "Where are you going? I was going to make espresso."
Classic film inspiration. O.P. Heggie, the blind hermit in Bride of Frankenstein. Also known for The French Connection, 1971, The Conversation, 1974, Superman, 1978. Favorite line?
Where are you going? I was going to make espresso.
Herr Falkstein, Richard Haydn.
The movie starts with Richard Haydn, Herr Falkstein, delivering the will of Beaufort Frankenstein to Freddie Frankenstein the Baron's great-great-grandson. People sometimes mistake Beaufort for being the mad grandfather Jean rails against in the opening scene, but Victor Frankenstein, Beaufort's son, and Freddy's grandfather, was really the insane doctor. Haydn was a lovely guy, a wonderful actor, but he was more interested in his garden than in acting, though he was also a health fanatic who only brought vegetables in for his lunch.
Also known for Forever Amber, 1947, Mutiny on the Bounty, 1962, The Sound of Music, 1965. Favorite and only line:
I have traveled 5,000 miles to bring you the will of your great-grandfather.
Mr. Hilltop, Liam Dunn.
Liam Dunn was actually a casting agent. I first saw him in 1972 in What's Up, Doc? He played the judge. I didn't know who he was, but I laughed my head off. It was his delivery. It was just so incredibly real and crazy. When I started doing Blazing Saddles, I immediately hired Liam as the preacher, and he exceeded all my hopes for crazy comedy. So I turned to him again to play Mr. Hilltop in Young Frankenstein. Liam communicated everything with his eyes when Gene Wilder put the clamps on his head and shoved his knee into Liam Dunn's balls, promising him his reflexes would be blocked by the clamps. I cut to Liam's crossed eyes, and it told us everything.
Classic film inspiration, The Three Stooges. Also known for What's Up, Doc? 1972, Blazing Saddles, 1974, Silent Movie, 1976. Favorite line:
Oh?
Chapter 3, A Cracker Jack Crew.
We had challenges. One of our challenges was we wanted to stay true to the look of the James Whale movies of the 1930s. We had 2.4 million. I mean, how could you make a big movie? And it's big. We were very lucky that MGM had a backlot, a beautiful bohemian village with cobblestones and gorgeous Bavarian houses. We were doing a period picture, so we wanted people who had worked as close to the ways of the old days as possible. People who knew what those studio pictures were, how they were made, what the work schedule was, and how cooperative and dedicated they had to be to get the things done. Our production designer, Dale Hennessy, had just done Dirty Harry and 2 Woody Allen films. His Frankenstein's castle looked like it was made out of sweating stone, like it was in the mountains where a mist had settled on the stone and left it wet. It was 15,000 square feet and 35 feet high. It was massive. When it came to the laboratory, he didn't just copy James Whale's set. He beat it. One of Dale Hennessy's right-hand men was his set decorator, Robert DeVestel. Robert was a sheer pleasure to work with and knew exactly how to complement each set with perfect chandeliers, drapes, tapestries, pewter platters, goblets, candelabras, and not to mention beautiful ancient stone stairs and floors. We had period equipment that filled our laboratory beautifully, but Robert DeVestel filled in all the empty spaces with turn-of-the-century test tubes, beakers, Bunsen burners, what have you. You couldn't have a better set photographer than John Monte. He got the best set pictures ever, and you never knew he was on the set. He never interfered in any way with the ongoing production. I'm forever grateful for his discretion and tact. He never held us up for a moment. I don't know how he got so many great pictures, but he did it. Gerald Hirschfeld, our cinematographer and director of photography, had done black and white films, and he showed me the examples of his work. Every one of them was backlit, like James Whale, with the angelic glow behind the actors' heads. He just really knew how to do it. He said to me, "You want this in the 30s, right?" I said, "Absolutely." And that's exactly what he gave me.
Lorraine Alterman Boyle reports on Mel.
Mel is in the middle of the graveyard, chewing the Trident gum that's recently replaced cigarettes in his life, and fingering the light filter that dangles like a monocle from a string around his neck. Mel is giving the gravediggers instructions. Do about 8 slow, hard counts. They shoot, and it's not right. The unit publicity man, an old-timer named John Campbell, who has worked with the likes of John Ford and John Huston, says he has never seen a director do as many takes as Mel. He figures it must be to get the timing perfect. And I can see that for a scene that probably lasts less than a minute, Mel spends a couple of hours to get it right. Gerald Hirschfeld on capturing Mel's vision.
I had recently moved from New York City to California, and I got an invitation to come meet Mel and Jean. I was very excited about recreating the look of James Whale's films. When I was introduced to Mel, he was very congenial, and then he started to pick apart some of the films I made. He was asking, "Why did you do that? And why did you do that?" After a while, I said, "I don't think you really want me to work on this film," and I got up to leave. With that, Gene Wilder got up and said, Jerry, sit down. Mel's just pulling your leg." After that, we were buddies. Mel always knew what he wanted, and he could express it. The challenge was how to recreate Whale's look with different lenses, different film stocks, and different lights than they had used in 1931. Nobody was making black and white movies in 1974. The film lab we used hadn't processed a black and white movie in more than 6 years. But I had started my career working in black and white, and I felt Mel was 100% correct in his insistence on shooting that way. We started shooting scenes with Gene Wilder in the Medical Institute before he gets to Transylvania. At the end of the first week of shooting, Mel and Gene asked me to stay after dailies. Mel said, "This is no good. This is not what we want." I said, "I don't understand. You asked me to look at the original Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, and that's what I'm giving you." But Mel and Gene wanted to satirize the scene. They wanted more than what's in Whale's films. I said, "Well then, tonight when we finish working, I'll try some things, and when you see the dailies tomorrow, you'll see if you like it better." So I relit, and the next day Mel and Gene looked and said, "That's more like it." It was almost entirely an issue of lighting. I knew Young Frankenstein should have a mood. I wanted it to be realistic in a sense and not phony in any way. The wall of the set was 35 feet tall, so one of the first things I did during pre-production was have the walls painted differently. They were much too dark, and I knew there was going to be a problem lighting them, so I went to the art director and said, "If it's painted lighter, I can control the darkness with my lighting." And that's what they did.
We made one compromise because Jerry was right in mimicking James Whale. He was right for the perfectionists. But I also wanted satire. So he made it a little crazier, a little bigger, a little satirical. Not as much as I wanted. I backed off and said, "You're right. I don't want to lose that universal look, that 1931 James Whale look." And that was the right way to go. Jerry was very smart, very good, and so hardworking and so caring. Jerry and I had one fight about a close-up of Gene and Terry. Jerry said, "I got to do it over again." There was a noticeable shake in the camera as it moved. I said, No, don't do it over. That's what I want. It's called photographic verisimilitude. It mimicked exactly the equipment James Whale had used. He would have shook too. He didn't have big rubber wheels. He didn't have plywood on the floor. He had a studio floor that was bumpy and crazy, and it gave it that 1931 quality that I was dying to get on the film.
Gerald Hirschfeld on the crew.
My crew was always a crackerjack crew because they know I'm very particular. The thing was, I would have to watch my camera operator during shooting because it was so funny on the set. He was sitting on the camera, and I could see the camera shaking. I had to say to him, "Listen, when you're laughing, you're shaking the camera. If you keep doing that, you're going to be out of here." Somehow the guy got himself under control. The interesting thing for all of us, especially for me and my gaffer, Jim Planette, was learning how to photograph a joke. We wanted the spooky James Whale lighting, and so we overemphasized the backlights that were the fashion in those days. But we didn't want to lose the comic nuances of expression on the actors' faces. We used light sources like firelight and lightning strikes to maintain the mood, but also to make sure the humor came through visually. This was also tricky for the sound department, who had to deal with the laboratory equipment that was always crackling with all sorts of noises we didn't want on the soundtrack.
I remember going out and getting 1,000 white handkerchiefs at the department store, I Magnet, and saying to the crew, if you feel like laughing, stick one of these white handkerchiefs in your mouth. I turned around once in the middle of shooting a scene and saw a sea of white handkerchiefs in everybody's mouth. I said to myself, we got a big hit here. This movie is going to make people crazy. It's really funny. Because there's only one test of comedy, and that's outright laughter. I don't care how beautiful the lighting is, how superlative the script is, how wonderful the performances are. If you're making a comedy and the crew isn't falling down, holding their bellies, screaming with laughter, you got a failure. But laughter is dangerous. You have to do it over again, so I stuck white handkerchiefs in their mouth, and it all worked. Shame on me, but it's true.
Lorraine Alterman Boyle on Madeline's arrival.
Madeline is driven onto the cobblestone courtyard in a circa 1928 limo. As Mel says, this picture is set in 1974, but in Transylvania, it's always 1930. Mel is getting exasperated with the liveried chauffeur because he drives the car a shade too fast and makes too much noise. Finally, the driver creeps in silently, but then he clunks Madeline's luggage down on the cobbles too hard, and that interferes with the dialogue. Someone puts down a furniture pad to muffle the sound. That finished, Mel is working on a bit taking place between Marty and Madeline while Jean is welcoming her. Marty wildly bites the fox boa and growls, and Madeline bops him on the head with her purse. We're suddenly doing the Marx Brothers, says Jean. You're all the Marx Brothers in this scene, Groucho, Harpo, and Zeppo, Mel answers. Each time they try to get through the I'll take the one in the turban line, everyone, actors, crew, and Mel, break up at Marty's perfect Groucho delivery. We're never going to make this scene, Mel finally states, holding back a smile. We're just going to laugh. Okay, to hell with the public. We had our laugh. 2 takes go smoothly, though Mel has his mouth buried in his forearm and silently shakes with mirth after each take is finished. Not totally satisfied with Jean's delivery on a line, Mel acts it out to indicate the emphasis he wants. Igor, would you give me a hand with the bags? The camera rolls, but this time Jean bursts into loud roars. Madeline and Terry get hysterical, and Marty collapses on one of the suitcases. Mel fumes. Will we ever get that timing again? The biting is good, rich. Jean interrupts. He bit off the foot. I was about to go on and I saw the foot in Marty's mouth and it wasn't attached to anything. It's not a real fox, is it? Marty worries. He's been a vegetarian for 34 years. Everyone assures him it's a fake, while Mel, inspired by the accident, tells Jean he wants him to treat Marty like a dog and command, down, down, drop it, drop it. After they reshoot, Mel tells me he actually bit off the foot. Oh! And his whole body is convulsed with laughter.
I'd like you to meet my assistants, Inga and Igor.
How do you do? How do you do?
This is my financier, Elizabeth.
Oh, I'm so happy to meet you at last.
Financé.
Excuse me, darling. What is it exactly that you do?
Well, I assist Dr. Frankenstein in the laboratory. We have intellectual discussions, and as a matter of fact, we were just having fun as you were driving.
What? Igor, would you give me a hand with the bags?
Certainly. You take the blonde, and I'll take the one in the turban.
Oh.
Stop that. I'm talking about the luggage.
Yes, master.
Ladies, this way.
It's going to be a long night. If you need any help with the girls, please don't hesitate.
Michael Gruskoff on creating the set.
Our production manager, Frank Bauer, made the astounding discovery that Kenneth Strickfaden, The special effects artist who had designed the marvelous sparking and buzzing lab equipment in Wales movies was living in Santa Monica with the original electrified props packed into his garage. So we went to Strickfaden's garage, and he plugged it all in for us. Mel and Jean were going crazy. They loved it. The only thing missing was Colin Clive's voice screaming, "It's alive! It's alive!" Strickfaden asked for a rental fee of $1,000 for the equipment. We looked at each other. That was too low, even for us. We gave him $2,500.
Kenneth Strickfaden, creator of the laboratory equipment.
In 1974, Strickfaden told the Los Angeles Times, "Most of the laboratory pieces used in Young Frankenstein are remnants of the original equipment, and some are copies. Some have been altered, and quite a few of them burned up in the intervening years. The cast and crew are so nice. They treat me like the old man that I am. Still, I put in a good day's work. I only watch the action when my equipment is in use. The rest of the time, I work on it. Brooks really knows what he's doing. He's after lots of comedy but doesn't want to lose the melodrama. His comedy for this is like a good Rembrandt, just a little dash of color in with the primary colors."
Dorothy Jenkins is perhaps the best period costume designer in the history of motion pictures. She had designed the costumes for The Sound of Music, The Misfits, Night of the Iguana. She was elegant and very experienced. And as far as we knew, she wasn't available. So we were looking at other people when we got a call. Jenkins is available. Well, we jumped on her, we got her, and I said, whatever she's asking for, give her more. I think we got her the day after she was free. We sat down and Dorothy said, for the villages, do you want Alsatian, German, Transylvanian, or maybe Bohemian? I said, yeah, good. We went with Bohemian because the village we had access to on the MGM back lot was definitely Bohemian. That's what the hats with the little feathers were, Bohemian. With the girls, with Madeline, with Terry, I asked to show as much cleavage as we were allowed, whatever we could get away with in 1974. They got away with a lot more in 31 than we did in 74, believe it or not, because they started enforcing the motion picture production code that dictated what you couldn't show, what you could show. So we showed what we could. The artisans we had were unbelievable, and they were thrilled to be working on a black and white picture. William Tuttle did the makeup for Singing in the Rain, North by Northwest, and The Twilight Zone. He was a master makeup artist. When I said to Bill Tuttle, you know, we're going to be making this in black and white, he just hugged me. He put his head right against my face and said, I was going to tell you that if you made it in color, the monster would look blue-green. It would be silly. But in black and white, the makeup would look incredible. He was so happy. And he showed me 3 or 4 different monster faces. I said to Bill, the monster can be dangerous, but it should also be beautiful and sometimes angelic.
William Tuttle on Making the Monster.
The zipper neck was something that Mel came up with. I have to give him credit for that. He said, can I have a zipper in his neck? And I said, well, I think so. And it's a real zipper, too. With Mel Brooks, there's always something new. Wonderful. It's a lot of fun working with him. Before Mel does a picture, he has a meeting with everybody, telling the whole story and playing all the parts, so he's very funny. We had this big thing where he wanted to know if we could show something happening with timed electric shocks, where the monster is coming to life. I came up with the idea of how to do that, where we show an X-ray of his bones.
Gerald Hirschfeld on special effects.
When it came to lighting the monster, I worked closely with Bill Tuttle. The green color of Peter Boyle's makeup looked fabulous in black and white. It really gave the skin a dead appearance. But the color popped more than the normal flesh tones of the other actors, so we always had to use a lower intensity key light on Peter Boyle, and we had to keep it really high, often hang it from the ceiling, to throw Peter's eyes into mysterious shadow. Bill was terrific. He also made a gorgeous beard for Gene Hackman, a huge chin mole for Cloris Leachman, and the mummified remains of Beaufort Frankenstein. We used a lot of effects on this film, more than I had ever used on a film before. To get that low-hanging fog, we relied on tons of dry ice, literally tons. The fireplaces had concrete logs so they wouldn't set the set on fire, and we used silk strips of fabric fluttering in front of lamps out of frame to create the effect of flickering firelight on the walls. The candles the actors held were made of aluminum pipe with 100-watt projection bulbs concealed inside. We ran a wire up the actor's sleeve and down the pant leg, so in addition to remembering their lines, they had to remember to keep the bulb hidden from the camera's view. This got tricky when we were doing close-ups of their faces. As they passed the camera, they had to rotate the candles so the walls would be illuminated. As you might imagine, it took a few extra takes to get all that right. Probably the effect I'm proudest of is the little girl we sent flying through the air into a second-story bedroom. We flew her on wires which I painted myself to conceal them with the lighting. Nowadays, you would remove those in post. We didn't have that option, but you still couldn't see them at all.
I'm sure we risked Peter Boyle's life many times in the making of this movie. Pouring boiling soup on him, lighting his thumb on fire. But for the scene where the monster comes alive, I couldn't do it to him. I said, well, cut away from Peter and then cut to a mask of him. Tuttle made a mask of Peter's face, and we put a green light bulb in it. It was on a dimmer, so it glowed very brightly and then went dark and then brightened again and darkened. If you look carefully at that shot, you maybe can tell it was just a plastic image of Peter's face, but with the humming electricity all around, it feels authentic. And that was what we wanted, authenticity. That little girl was good. Ann Beasley was her name. She had pigtails, she was very bossy, and she flew like a missile. In the editing room, we used a few cutaways to the monster's face to conceal the wires, and then picked it up again when she lands on the bed.
Chapter 4. I Don't Want to Go Home.
On the last day of shooting, after we shot the last scene, and everybody had left, Gene sat down at the edge of the bed we had used in the scene with him and Terry. He said, I've got some more ideas for some other scenes for this movie. I said, Gene, we've finished the movie. It's over. We shot it out. It's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's perfect. Gene buried his face in his hands and said, Mel, I don't want to go home. I love this movie. I want to stay here. This is the happiest time of my life. I guess it really was. Every time I did a movie, at lunch, I used to go to my trailer, lie down, sleep for 20 minutes, get up, have some fruit on the top of some cottage cheese, and get back to the set. But with Young Frankenstein, I loved everybody. I loved everybody who worked on that set. The actors, the crew. We made sure we all had lunch together in the commissary at Fox. When we finished shooting, it was hard to let it go. By this point, Blazing Saddles had arrived in theaters and had become a big hit, beyond any of our expectations. We were hot, but in the editing room, we were cold. I was working with my editor, John Howard, and Gene would join us. It was much harder to edit Young Frankenstein than it had ever been to edit Blazing Saddles. On Blazing Saddles, I just had to find and isolate the emotions. Young Frankenstein was a much more technically eloquent film. Sometimes I'd be stuck between the most gorgeous black and white shot and a Marty Feldman moment of comedy. I usually chose the Marty Feldman moment of comedy, I gotta be honest with you. I also found it very difficult to choose how to transition from one scene to another. I didn't want to undo the art of the film by just settling for the comedy. I ended up going back to James Whale as often as I did on this movie. I went back to the old-fashioned 1920s editing techniques, the irises in, the irises out, the spins, the wipes. Not only did they lend a feeling of authenticity to Whale's work and his era, they also helped the movie move seamlessly between comedy and art.
Gene Wilder on editing.
After seeing a film put together for the first time, a director usually wants to vomit because it doesn't have any of the rhythms the director had in mind while filming. I joined Mel each day in the editing room to look at whatever editor John Howard had put together. When we saw the ascension scene, where I rise with the creature on an elevated platform and cry, "Life, do you hear me? Give my creation life!" my heart sank. I thought this was going to be one of the highlights of the film, and instead, it was a boring blob. I put my head down. Mel didn't vomit. Instead, he got up and started banging his head on the wall. He hit it 3 times, hard. Then he turned his face to the rest of us and said, "Let's not get excited. You have just witnessed a 14-minute disaster. In 1 week, you're going to see a 12-minute, fairly rotten scene. In 2 weeks, you're going to see a 10-minute, fairly good scene. And in 3 weeks, you're going to see an 8-minute masterpiece." That's a cute speech, I thought, but you're kidding yourself or just trying to make us feel better. How much can you change without reshooting? I saw the scene. I don't believe in miracles. The next 3 weeks were my second lesson in directing. Thousands of little pieces of film can be arranged in thousands of different ways. Almost 3 weeks to the day after Mel's speech, the lights went out in the screening room, and I witnessed an 8-minute miracle.
My editor, John Howard, was so confident, and he had the right to be. He was one of the best. Prior to making Blazing Saddles with me, he edited Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I used him on every movie I could. But as confident as he was, I said, "John, don't do any rough cut. I'll sit with you, and we'll cut frame by frame together. You don't get a jump on it. I want to be there when every frame goes together." I said that because sometimes you get an image you kind of like, and you're stuck with it. You don't want to cut it out. I wanted both of us to vote on every frame right from the beginning. And if you didn't vote with me, I went with my vote because I'm the director. One of our biggest challenges was editing out the laughter on the set. We were constantly cutting away to close-ups to avoid somebody breaking up. For instance, in the scene where Dr. Frankenstein stabs himself in the leg with the scalpel, we used a close-up of Gene saying, "Class dismissed," to cut away from the take where Gene was losing it.
John Morris on composing the music.
Mel said for Young Frankenstein, which is really a horror film basically, writing scary music was totally inappropriate and had nothing to do with the main character. Mel told me to write the most beautiful Eastern European lullaby that you can. That would become the heart of the monster. It would be his childhood. I understood him, because Mel always goes for the emotional center of something. It's not that Mel didn't want scary music. It was just another kind of movie. It was an emotional movie. You just have to write honest music.
The first time I composed that John Morris and I worked together was on The Producers. He was very gentle, very soft-spoken guy, incredibly gifted. He went on to work with me on The 12 Chairs and then Blazing Saddles. We looked at horror movie music, but it wasn't rich enough. Instead, John went way back into Transylvanian folk music, came up with this incredible gypsy song, a gorgeous theme. A studio violinist by the name of Jerry Vinci played it for us. The movie wouldn't have been half as good without that magnificent score. God bless John Morris. He gave the film its soul.
Michael Gruskoff on Mel editing.
By the time Mel was in the editing room on Young Frankenstein, Blazing Saddles had come out and become a huge success. It would go on to become one of the highest-grossing films of 1974, and suddenly Mel and Gene were both major players. As a result, the studio trusted Mel and left him alone to do what he clearly did so well, put together a hilarious movie. One of his best qualities is his instincts. He just has a knack of knowing, and that allows him to take chances, whether it's during the writing process, on set, or in post-production. What can I tell you? He just has a lot of confidence in himself, which allows him to be bold.
The first test screening I had for Young Frankenstein was 2 hours and 22 minutes. That's pretty damn long for me. I make 88-minute movies. I don't even make 90-minute movies. Anyway, I played it, at the little theater on the 20th Century Fox lot for people who worked on the lot, secretaries and such. The theater was packed, and we got only about half the laughs we were aiming for, and it was a little dismal. It was too long, and the movie really didn't work. So at the end of the movie, I made a speech. I said, ladies and gentlemen, you've just seen a 2-hour and 22-minute failure. In less than 3 weeks, I want you all back here to see a 95-minute smash hit movie. I want every one of you back. And over the next few weeks, I chopped and I cut all the information that wasn't necessary. I cut punchlines that didn't work. For instance, I must have taken 2 or 3 minutes out of the scene with the little girl at the well. It was empty talk. I got 2 minutes out of the village scene where the townspeople rail against the Frankensteins, worried that there's a monster in the making. In the charades, I cut out some of the struggling so Inga and Igor got what Dr. Frankenstein was trying to say just a little faster. I didn't take scenes out. I kept every scene. I just shaved them down. And in 3 weeks, I used the same crowd. They came back. I showed them the film. They stood up and cheered. It was a 95-minute success. They loved it. And then we took it to Pasadena for a screening. It never failed again.
Playing charades.
The charade scene was a very tough one to shoot because it had to look like the monster was choking the life out of Dr. Frankenstein. Peter Boyle kept saying, I'm afraid, I'm afraid. Gene keeps moving and my arm is around his neck. I'm worried. And I said, look, if he dies, he dies. And Gene kept saying, hey, wait a minute. It was also tricky because you never knew when Marty went to light that match whether it would light or not. The match had to strike perfectly. And quite often, when we were shooting, it didn't. Or it lit and sputtered and the flame wasn't big enough or it went out. It had to be big enough to scare the monster. Sometimes Gene would start laughing because Marty came up with so much wonderful stuff. The way Gene and Marty worked, it was as if they were in a vaudeville show somewhere in London. They were wonderful. 2 great artists working together.
Chapter 5. It's Alive. The Marketing and Release.
The studio thought they were going to get into a lot of trouble with the big theater chains because Young Frankenstein was in black and white. They were afraid people were going to say, who wants to see black and white now? But because it was black and white, it was different. And a lot of people went to see it. We had a people's premiere at the AFCO Theater in Westwood in L.A. And there were lines around the block. Yes, lines around the block. I was so proud and so pleased. Of all my films, I think I love Young Frankenstein the most. I had to walk a very careful line not to be foolishly funny, but to be genuinely funny. It was difficult, and I think I accomplished it about 80 or 90% of the time. First, you say to yourself, oh, that was a little cheap there, or just going for the laugh. All these things run through your head. I didn't set it up well enough. It doesn't really work. It's not really in that character's psyche. But then time passes, and then you can really tell how you feel about it. I was thrilled when we got the Oscar nominations for adapted screenplay and for sound. But I did wish they had nominated Gene's performance. In my mind, it was Promethean. He really felt that character and played him to the skies. Strangely enough, the movie's reputation has grown over time. With Young Frankenstein, I was after both art and humor. I tried to do some things that were a little smarter, a little better, and hoped the audience would join me. They don't always join me, you know, but on Young Frankenstein, they sort of did.
Creating the poster.
The look of the movie. What should the look of the movie be? We had a great picture, and now we needed a great poster. I went right back to Anthony Goldschmidt, who was at the time one of the best graphic designers in Hollywood. He had designed Blazing Saddles, which John Alvin, a truly great artist, had painted. I immediately knew I wanted the same combination, Goldschmidt for design and John Alvin for illustration. Fortunately for us, there is a book encompassing all the great movie artwork of John Alvin, all the work he created in the last 40 years. The following is an excerpt from his wife's book, The Art of John Alvin. Here's what Andrea Alvin has to say about Young Frankenstein.
Young Frankenstein came very close behind Blazing Saddles. The big difference was that now John was working directly with Mel Brooks. Since the Blazing Saddles poster was so successful, John had become his own hard act to follow. Could he create a poster that was as good or better than the first? There were several conceptual directions taken before the poster that we know, but no one seems to know what happened to those sketches and paintings. This is the unfortunate situation with many of the posters that John did. However, there is one painting that I remember clearly. It was a large painting, probably 40 by 60 inches, in oil on canvas. It depicted the monster and Dr. Frankenstein wearing their tuxedos in a dancing pose from the film's Puttin' on the Ritz musical number. They are on stage with the title below, hand-painted as if dripping blood. I believe this was in contention for the poster for a while, but was eventually rejected because it was a scene that did not represent the scope of the film. John was young and very serious about his work and wanted to make a good impression, and there were times he would come home frustrated by a meeting on the project. He felt Brooks was so smart and tuned in to what his film was about, but if there were more than 3 people in the room, he became Mel Brooks the comedian. It was hysterical and entertaining, but not necessarily productive. Welcome to Hollywood. At one meeting, John was presenting concept sketches. Mel wanted everything big. He kept asking for various elements to be bigger. John kept explaining that if everything was bigger, nothing would look big. Brooks insisted that it would work. Eventually, John said, "I'm really having trouble with this," handed Brooks the pad and pencil and said, "Show me." Brooks laughed, and that ended the conflict. As for big, Brooks got his wish. The poster was painted as a billboard on the side of what was then the Playboy building on Sunset Strip, making it the biggest billboard of its time. John painted the final poster art traditionally in oil on canvas at about 40 by 60 inches. The only major change was to Gene Wilder's face. Brooks and the studio wanted a shot taken directly from the film, so John had to paint out the old face and paint in the new one. Luckily, in oils, this can be done. Michael Gruskoff on the release.
We were laughing so hard when we were watching the dailies and were hoping it all hung together as well as it seemed while we were filming. I remember a car ride with Mel and his wife Ann Bancroft to a sneak preview of the film. They had this great relationship. She's an Italian from the Bronx, he's a Jew from Brooklyn, and they had a great deal of respect for each other. While driving to San Bernardino, which is like Middle America in a way, Mel acted up about why the studio had picked this place to preview our film. Ann would say a few words that would relax him, and after we saw the audience's reaction, the trip back to L.A. was as smooth as could be. 20th Century Fox thought December was a good time to release the film. We would be piggybacking off Mel's success with Blazing Saddles. In early December, we had an artist named Anthony Goldschmidt, who had done the poster for the movie, paint the largest billboard ever on the side of the Playboy building on Sunset Strip. It was 5,600 square feet, took 86,000 gallons of paint, and was lit up by 14 Klieg lights. It was unmissable. Mel called Hugh Hefner, and we screened the film at the Playboy Mansion. Hef went crazy for it and wound up showing it to his friends the next night. When Fox told us we would open on December 15th and be up against The Towering Inferno, which opened on December 14th, and The Godfather Part 2, which opened on December 20th, it sent shivers up my spine. But our reviews were great, and the audience came out in droves. We ended up making $86 million domestically, which in today's numbers would be equivalent to $413 million. And Young Frankenstein was released in 21 other countries. Not only were we happy for ourselves, but for Laddie as well. Young Frankenstein, which he brought into Fox, helped elevate him and put him in a position to greenlight over 300 films during his illustrious career, including Star Wars, Alien, Blade Runner, A Fish Called Wanda, Thelma and Louise, plus many more films with Mel.
Alan Ladd Jr. on the release.
We had a number of preview screenings, mainly because they went so very well. Mel just wanted to preview and preview and preview. We'd be previewing to this day, I think, if I let him. We'd screened for every one of his relatives. He had a relative in Corona, one here, one there. Cousins were coming out of the woodwork. Why are we going here? Oh, I have a cousin Charlie. Okay. Finally, we just ran out of places to preview. But Mel's best audience was his wife, Anne. She would go to all the previews and she would laugh harder than anybody else. She was a great audience. She honestly loved the movie. She wasn't just being a nice wife. We released the movie and it was a big hit. Then it was on television all the time. I make it a point not to watch movies I've been involved with after they've been released. I don't want to sit there and see it on television and say, oh, geez, we should have cut this scene out. Why did we do this, or why did we do that? But if Young Frankenstein is on, I always watch it because it makes me laugh. On this movie, I just went along for the ride. It was a moment in Hollywood when we were allowing people their own personal expressions, whereas today, that's not as true. Now it's very corporate. It's not warm and friendly. The studios don't each have their own personalities now. It's very different.
Roger Ebert, 1974 film review.
In his two best comedies before this, The Producers and Blazing Saddles, Brooks revealed a rare comic anarchy. His movies weren't just funny, they were aggressive and subversive, making us laugh even when we really should have been offended. Explaining this process, Brooks once loftily declared, "My movies rise below vulgarity." Young Frankenstein is as funny as we expect a Mel Brooks comedy to be, but it's more than that. It shows artistic growth and a more sure-handed control of the material by a director who once seemed willing to do literally anything for a laugh. It's more confident and less breathless. That's partly because the very genre he's satirizing gives him a strong narrative he can play against. Brooks's targets are James Whale's Frankenstein, 1931, and Bride of Frankenstein, 1935, the first, the most influential, and the second, probably the best, of the 1930s Hollywood horror movies. Brooks uses carefully controlled black-and-white photography that catches the feel of the earlier films. He uses old-fashioned visual devices and obvious special effects. The train ride is a study in manufactured studio scenes. He adjusts the music to the right degree of squeakiness, and he even rented the original Frankenstein laboratory with its zaps of electricity, high-voltage special effects, and elevator platform to intercept lightning bolts. So the movie is a send-up of a style and not just of the material, as Paul Morrissey's dreadful Andy Warhol's Frankenstein. It looks right, which makes it funnier. And then, paradoxically, it works on a couple of levels. First as comedy, and then as a weirdly touching story in its own right. A lot of the credit for that goes to the performances of Gene Wilder as young Frankenstein and Peter Boyle as the monster. They act broadly when it's required, but they also contribute tremendous subtlety and control. Boyle somehow manages to be hilarious and pathetic at the same time. There are set pieces in the movie that deserve comparison with the most famous scenes in The Producers. Demonstrating that he has civilized his monster, for example, Frankenstein and the creature do a soft shoe number in Black Tie and Tails. Wandering in the woods, the monster comes across a poor blind monk, Gene Hackman, very good, who offers hospitality and winds up scalding, burning, and frightening the poor creature half to death. There are also the obligatory town meetings, lynch mobs, police investigations, laboratory experiments, love scenes, and a cheerfully ribald preoccupation with a key area of the monster's stitched-together anatomy. From its opening title, which manages to satirize Frankenstein and Citizen Kane at the same time, to its closing, refrain, Young Frankenstein is not only a Mel Brooks movie, but also a loving commentary on our love-hate affairs with monsters. This time, the monster even gets to have a little love-hate affair of his own.
Charles Champlin, Los Angeles Time Review, 1974.
The movie may be slapstick, but it's not slapdash. It has been conceived and completed as a coherent whole, done in luminously perfect black and white. Everything, most particularly the music, is poignantly faithful to the spirit of old times. There are vaudeville jokes that may well be older than Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley herself, but they are spaced along a carefully developed storyline which is executed by a team of hugely talented comic actors rather than one-lining comics.
I've been shocked and flattered by the afterlife Young Frankenstein has had in the decades since we first released it. In 2014, on the 40th anniversary of this film, Fox hired an artist to paint a giant mural of the cast and myself on the wall of Stage 5, where we shot most of the film. The studio also named the street adjacent to the stage Mel Brooks Boulevard. I guess that gives the studio execs an opportunity to walk all over me once again every day, but still it's flattering. We were also honored that the American Film Institute placed us on their list of the 100 funniest American movies of all time, and the National Film Preservation Board deemed us culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, and selected us for preservation in the Library of Congress. That's what we were going for with our backlit monster and our sweating stone walls and our beautiful castle. Aesthetic, significant. When we opened Young Frankenstein as a musical on Broadway in 2007, with a book by myself and Thomas Meehan, it gave me an opportunity to see how much people love and know the movie. The audience would neigh when anybody on stage said Frau Blucher, and they were dying for the blind man to spill soup on the monster's lap. That is the most gratifying feeling when your film lives on with new generations of fans. I think it's my best work. I really do. It seems like a lot of people agree with me.
This has been a Hachette audio production of a Mel Brooks book, Young Frankenstein, the story of the making of the film, written by Mel Brooks with Rebecca Keegan, with a foreword written and read by Judd Apatow, read by Mel Brooks, Michael Gruskoff, Ellen Archer, and Robert Petkoff. Includes a Mac and PC-compatible PDF of photos. Produced by Michelle McGonigal. Directed by Dennis Kao and Michelle McGonigal. Recorded by Billy Centenero, The Village Studios, Los Angeles, and Charles McCrory, Hachette Audio Studios, New York City. Post-production by Michelle McGonigal. Original lyrics from Puttin' on the Ritz by Irving Berlin. Copyright 1928-1929 by Irving Berlin. Copyright renewed. International copyright secured. All rights reserved. Used by permission. Audio footage from Young Frankenstein, courtesy of 20th Century Fox. All rights reserved. Book conceived by Mel Brooks and Michael Gruskoff. Special thanks to Mel Brooks' assistant, Shelby Van Vliet, Michael Gruskoff's assistant, Daniel Poor, Judd Apatow's assistant, Sam Fischel, Gianna Bombando and Esme Perry Trueheart at 20th Century Fox Photo Archives, and Andy Bandit, 20th Century Fox Clips Licensing. Young Frankenstein is also available in print and digital formats from Black Dog and Leventhal Publishers, a division of Hachette Book Group. For more Hachette audio productions, visit us at hachetteaudio.com. Thank you for listening. Text copyright 2016 by Brooks Films Limited. Forward copyright 2016 by Judd Apatow. Audio production copyright 2016 by Hachette Audio. All rights reserved. Hachette Book Group supports the right to free expression and the value of copyright. The purpose of copyright is to encourage writers and artists to produce the creative works that enrich our culture. The duplicating, uploading, and distribution of this audiobook without permission is a theft of the author's intellectual property. If you would like permission to use material from the audiobook, other than for review purposes, please contact permissions@hbgusa.com. Thank you for your support of the author's rights.